So, if you think the story of Yusuf, like Joseph in the wilderness, is just this quaint, ancient fairy tale about, a favorite boy, a jealous family, and some magical dream, you really need to completely recalibrate.
Oh, absolutely. It's so much more than that.
Right, because you sent us this massive stack of sociological, linguistic, and historical sources to decode. And honestly, what strikes me immediately looking at your notes is just how fiercely these texts reject that whole, Sunday school framing.
Yeah, they don't pull any punches.
No, they don't. Today's deep dive is pulling from an analysis that claims these first 14 verses of Surah Yusuf, they aren't a bedtime story at all. It explicitly positions this narrative as like a diagnostic manual for societal collapse. It's literally the code of a revolutionary.
And the premise the source material establishes from the very first page is, well, it's bracing. It outlines this entire theory of social physics.
Social physics, I love that term.
Right. It basically says that when a society system decays, when it reaches the absolute peak of corruption, where justice is commodified, where the powerful just operate totally above the law and ethical constraints just vanish, that's when a revolutionary figure emerges.
Right.
In the text's terminology, this figure is a Nabi. But what makes this specific analysis so unique is its relentless focus on how macroscopic societal change it's fundamentally impossible without microscopic individual character.
And that is the part that completely flips the modern script on leadership for me. I mean, we are so accustomed to thinking of societal shifts in terms of like macroeconomics or technological revolutions or military conquest.
External leverage points, basically.
Exactly. We look for external leverage points. But the sources you provided argue that a nation's rise and fall is directly, inextricably tied to individual character, specifically pointing to chastity, integrity, and the strict adherence to internal principles.
Yeah, it makes the rather shocking argument that a society's sexual ethics and an individual's personal restraint are actually the bedrock of political stability.
Which is wild to think about.
It really forces us to look at leadership through an entirely different lens, If an individual cannot master their own internal, emotional, and biological impulses, well, they lack the foundational blueprint required to master and reorganize a chaotic external society.
But you can't engineer a just civilization if your own internal landscape is just ruled by unmitigated desire.
Exactly. And the text treats this not as some moralistic platitude, but as an observable law of social physics.
Okay, so if we are going to decode this manual, this code of a revolutionary, we have to start exactly where your sources start. And they begin by demanding something very specific from the reader.
They do. They don't ask for blind faith.
Right. And they don't ask for submission either. They heavily emphasize the absolute necessity of the human intellect. The text actually calls itself a clear book. Quran Is Mubeen in the original Arabic.
Yeah.
Revealed in clear Arabic specifically so that people may use their intellect.
The word used there is aql. Right?
Yes, aql, which translates to rational thought, logical deduction, and rigorous reflection.
And that emphasis on aql sets the operational ground rules for literally everything that follows. I mean, when a text declares itself mubeen, it is stating that its principles are transparent, they're accessible, they're meant to be subjected to human reasoning. It is the absolute antithesis of ambiguity.
But wait, I have to jump in here and kind of play devil's advocate for a second, because there is this glaring historical contradiction.
Okay, lay it on me.
Well, if this text is supposedly so inherently clear, so rational, and built entirely on the engine of reason, how do we explain the last 1,000 years of history? I mean, for centuries, people have built entire institutions claiming this exact same text is actually full of hidden mystical secrets.
Yeah, the esoteric code.
Exactly. This idea that there's a hidden meaning that bypasses logic and can only be accessed by, a select few enlightened masters who have retreated to a mountaintop somewhere.
Well, the source material actually spends a significant amount of time aggressively dismantling that exact historical contradiction. It vehemently rejects the notion of what is historically called batin, this idea of chest-to-chest secret esoteric knowledge.
Right.
The sources argue that reading a mystical secret layer into a text that explicitly calls itself clear is not just a misinterpretation, it's an active destruction of the text's core purpose.
The analogy your sources use to dismantle this is incredibly sharp, actually.
Yeah.
It compares the text to the sun.
Oh, I love this part.
Right. It says the sun does not require external independent witnesses to prove its shining. It doesn't need a philosopher to write some complex treatise arguing for the existence of daylight while you were standing outside at noon.
You just look up.
Exactly. Its existence is self-evident to anyone with open eyes. Therefore, understanding this text requires your own rational, conscious reflection, not a secret password or, a mystical decoder ring handed down by some guru.
And the implications of that analogy for societal structure are just massive. We have to ask why a rational mind is so strictly required to understand leadership in this context, and why the text is so intensely hostile to the idea of mystical, hidden knowledge.
And it comes down to the mechanics of power and accountability, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because the sustainable system of justice cannot be built on an inaccessible feeling. I mean, just think about the physical reality of a functioning society. If I am accused of a crime, or if I am engaged in a contract dispute, the law governing that interaction has to be objective. It has to be readable and mutually understood.
Right, you need a shared reality.
Yeah. I cannot walk into a courtroom and have a judge tell me, well, my chest-to-chest mystical intuition tells me you are guilty, but I can't explain the logical framework to you because you aren't spiritually advanced enough.
Which is terrifying. Because the moment you introduce the idea that the rules governing a society are based on inaccessible secret knowledge, you completely destroy the mechanism of accountability.
Completely.
You inevitably create a hierarchy where a knowing elite can just dictate terms to the ignorant masses without ever having to rationally justify a single action. Absolute power is basically born in the shadows of ambiguous, untestable claims.
It's such a brilliant trap. If the law is mystical, the leader is unquestionable. And unquestionable leaders inevitably create the exact systemic decay and corruption the revolutionary is trying to fix in the first place.
Exactly. By demanding aql and declaring the text mubeen, the system democratizes the intellect. It forces the leadership to operate in the daylight, totally subject to the logical scrutiny of the public.
So moving from that foundational clarity, the source material executes this fascinating transition. It demands cold reason, right?
All right.
But the very next verse 3, plunges us straight into the realm of stories and dreams. It introduces the phrase Ahsan al-Qasas.
Right, which, if you look at almost any traditional translation, is rendered as the best of stories.
Yeah, which evokes this image of, people gathering around a campfire to hear the greatest fictional epic ever told. But your linguistic sources just tear that translation apart.
They really do.
They argue that Ahsan al-Qasas does not mean a fictional tale. It translates more accurately to the best method of conveying facts, or the best narrative structure.
Because the linguistic root of qasas actually involves following tracks or tracing footsteps to their origin. It is an investigative term. So Ahsan al-Qasas isn't about entertaining an audience at all. It's about structuring complex data, historical, psychological, sociological facts in a sequence that perfectly tracks cause and effect. It is a highly structured transmission of reality.
But why use narrative at all? I mean, if the text is supposed to be the ultimate manual of pure reason, why not just provide a bulleted list of laws? Why go through the effort of tracing a narrative arc?
Well, because the text is addressing the human mind. And the human mind does not process raw data as effectively as it processes sequential logic wrapped in human experience.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and to explain how this works, the source text takes this profound detour into modern psychology. It sets up a contrast between true intellect divine revelation, or wahi in the text terminology, and the chaotic ordinary functioning of the human unconscious mind.
And this detour into psychology is where the sources get incredibly vivid. They provide an analogy for the unconscious mind that is honestly hard to forget.
The dark storehouse.
Yes. Imagine the human unconscious as this massive, unlit, deeply buried storehouse in the back of your brain. Every single day of your life, you generate thoughts, desires, fears, goals, and many of those are unmet or actively repressed. Society tells you not to act on certain impulses, so you push them down.
Right, you stuff them away.
Every time you repress a desire or ignore a fleeting fear, it gets thrown into this dark storehouse.
And the source compares these repressed fragments to chopped up strips of celluloid film. You have millions of these disconnected, isolated frames of emotion, memory, and impulse just piling up in the dark over the course of decades.
Now, what happens when your conscious mind, the rational gatekeeper, the alcohol shuts down? This happens every night when you go to sleep, or it can happen under the influence of anesthesia or during deep hypnosis. The gatekeeper leaves its post.
And suddenly the unconscious mind just takes over.
Exactly. Wanders into that dark storehouse, starts grabbing these random chopped up film strips, and frantically stitches them together.
It acts as this completely undisciplined editor. It will splice a frame of a childhood fear of dogs directly onto a frame of a repressed desire for power, directly onto a fragment of an argument you had with your boss yesterday.
And it projects that stitched together, chaotic reel onto the screen of your mind as a bizarre, non-linear movie. That is the mechanical explanation for what we experience as ordinary dreams.
And here is where the text analysis becomes highly critical of certain historical movements. The source points out that many people, lacking an understanding of this exact psychological mechanism, experience these stitched-together movies of their own repressed psychology and mistakenly view them as profound mystical visions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they experience what the esoteric traditions call kashish, or ilham mystical unveiling, when in reality they are just watching a projection of their own fragmented unconscious noise.
I want to push back on that, or at least clarify the scope of this claim, because it is massive.
Yeah.
Are the sources seriously arguing that all historical claims of mystical visions, trances, and esoteric awakenings are basically nothing more than people hallucinating their repressed childhood memories?
Well, it's bold, but the sources draw a categorical line in the sand here. They argue that unless a vision or an insight is deeply grounded in pure intellect, observable reality, and clear, actionable logic, unless it is subject to aql, it is highly likely to be psychological noise. The text aggressively separates the phenomenon of that unconscious film strip editing from the true intellect and foresight required for leadership.
Which totally forces us to look at the narrative of Yusuf with completely fresh eyes. Because when we arrive at verses 4 through 6, we are presented with what looks, on its face, exactly like a teenager's fragmented wish fulfillment dream.
Right, the famous dream.
Yeah, we are told Yusuf is around 15 or 16 years old at this time. He goes to his father, Yaqub, and says he had a vision. He saw 11 stars, the sun and the moon, and they were prostrating or bowing down to him.
Now, if we were to apply the standard literal reading that the text has explicitly warned us against, we would be forced to interpret this as a magical event. We would have to picture literal celestial bodies burning balls of gas millions of miles away, breaking the laws of physics to bow to a teenager in the desert.
Or we'd interpret it as the ultimate narcissistic hallucination of a younger brother who just wants his older siblings and his parents to worship him. Look at me, I'm the king.
Right. But the source completely challenges both the magical and the narcissistic interpretation. If this text is a manual of reason, then celestial bodies aren't literally bowing, and this isn't an ego trip. This vision is the birth of a visionary leader's objective.
Yes. To understand the vision, we have to decode the symbols using the sociological language of the ancient Near East. The sun, moon, and stars are not astronomical entities in this context. They are established metaphors for powerful societal forces.
Think about the physical reality of the ancient world for a second. The sun and the moon were the ultimate deciders of life and death. They dictated the seasons, the harvest, the difference between freezing in the dark or thriving in the light.
So consequently, the people who controlled the calendars, who interpreted the seasons, who commanded the vast tribes, they were represented by these celestial bodies.
Exactly. They represent the power brokers, the disparate institutions, the tribal leaders with massive followings, the economic forces that drive society. And Yusuf's vision is an incredibly sophisticated blueprint for the future of his civilization.
He is seeing that these currently chaotic, warring, and scattered societal forces will eventually align. They will be brought under a single, unifying law and a central administrative authority.
It is a radical shift in perspective. It's not a teenager saying, I'm going to be a king and everyone will be my servant. It is a revolutionary realizing the only way to cure the disease of this broken tribal world is to bring all of these autonomous destructive power centers into a cohesive system of justice.
It's literally a blueprint for administrative unity.
And that reframing is entirely supported by the father's immediate reaction in the text. Upon hearing this vision, Yaqub does not reprimand him for arrogance, nor does he fall to his knees in worship. He recognizes the intellectual magnitude of what Yusuf has grasped. He tells Yusuf that God will teach him tawil al-Ahadith.
And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood terms in the entire narrative. When I first encountered tawil al-Ahadith, I assumed it was just an ancient, elegant way of saying dream interpretation.
Oh, a lot of people do.
Yeah, I thought it meant God was going to give him like a mental dictionary of symbols, like he becomes the guy you go to when you dream about your teeth falling out, and he flips through a book and says, Page 42 of the Dream Dictionary. That means you are stressed about your harvest?
Our source text goes out of its way to correct that exact misconception. Ta'wil has absolutely nothing to do with looking up arbitrary symbols in a mystical dictionary. Linguistically, the root of tawa means reaching the ultimate consequence of an event.
Reaching the ultimate consequence.
Yes. It is the cognitive ability to observe an action, a policy, or a sequence of current events and mathematically trace the chain reaction to its absolute, inevitable conclusion.
It is foresight functioning at the highest possible level.
The source actually correlates this concept with what the French philosopher Henri Bergson called intuition. But we have to be careful with that word because Bergson's definition of intuition isn't a gut feeling or a hunch. Bergson argued that analytical intelligence breaks things down into static, isolated parts to understand them, which often causes us to lose sight of the living, moving whole. Intuition, in the Bergsonian sense, is a higher form of intellect that immerses itself in the flow of reality. It synthesizes countless unseen variables simultaneously, grasping the entire trajectory of a system instantly.
To make this concrete for you listening, the source uses an incredible comparison between a politician and a statesman, and this perfectly illustrates the difference between standard intelligence and ta'wil.
I love this analogy.
It's so good. Consider the modern politician. A politician's entire existence is reactive. They operate entirely in the present tense. If the stock market dips, they issue a press release. If a scandal breaks, they execute damage control. If a poll shifts, they change their rhetoric.
They are constantly treating the immediate symptom, just trying to survive the 24-hour news cycle.
Exactly. It's like a doctor treating a cough with cough syrup. They are addressing the noise the body is making right now.
But a statesman, a leader operating with ta'wil, with this higher Bergsonian intuition, operates on an entirely different cognitive plane. They do not react to the present. They observe it as a single data point in a much larger trajectory.
The statesman looks at a seemingly minor policy change in education, a subtle shift in cultural tone in the media, and a small fluctuation in the price of a raw material. While the politician sees three unrelated news stories, the statesman links the unseen chain reactions.
Right.
They realize that these three variables, interacting over 20 years, will inevitably result in the total collapse of a specific industry and a massive cultural upheaval. They foresee the ultimate conclusion. Going back to our doctor analogy, the statesman hears the same cough, but immediately recognizes that the specific resonance of that cough means the city's water supply is poisoned. They don't prescribe cough syrup, they begin restructuring the aqueducts.
To further anchor this concept, the source shares a brilliant poetic illustration from the philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal describes a scene in a garden to capture this exact state of mind. He says, imagine you have hundreds of wise men, botanists, and gardeners standing around a single plant. They're arguing, debating, and measuring the delicate leaves, completely absorbed in the minute details of the present moment. They are using analytical intelligence.
But then the true visionary, the statesman with ta'wil, walks into the same garden. They don't look at the leaves. They look down and observe a single dry thorn on the ground. And in that one micro detail, they immediately comprehend the entire macroscopic condition of the garden.
They see the root rot happening beneath the soil, the impending drought, the failure of the irrigation system, and the inevitable death of the entire ecosystem. They look at the thorn and they understand the garden.
And Yusuf's vision is the ultimate display of this foresight. He looks at the microscopic dynamic of his own fragmented, chaotic family, and using ta'wil, he immediately understands the macroscopic condition of his entire civilization. He foresees the ultimate inevitable necessity of a unified system of law to prevent societal collapse.
But of course, the moment a visionary intelligence diagnoses the rot in the garden fights back.
It always does.
The moment you introduce a revolutionary concept that threatens the status quo, the existing system reacts with brutal, self-preserving force. And that brings us to the actual mechanics of societal collapse. Social physics, and the anatomy of a conspiracy, starting in verses 8 and 9.
The narrative shifts abruptly here, from the high-level intellectual foresight of Yusuf to the visceral, emotional reality of the society surrounding him. And the text uses Yusuf's own family as the microcosm for this societal decay. We see the reaction of his 11 half-brothers to his existence.
They begin to scheme. They form a conspiracy to remove him, and the justification they use to validate this conspiracy is literally a masterclass in political science.
They declare, "Our father favors Yusuf and his brother over us, even though we are a strong, cohesive group." The specific Arabic word used in the text for their group is usba, and they conclude, clearly, our father is wandering in manifest error. We need to spend time layering the explanation of that word usba because it is the absolute fulcrum of the social physics being described here. Linguistically, usba refers to muscle, nerve, and sinew. It denotes a group bound together by unbreakable physical and biological ties. In the sociological framework of the ancient world, it represents physical strength, numerical superiority, and bloodlines. This is the bedrock of what historians call Asabiyyah, or in the context of pre-Islamic Arabia, Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance.
Let's ground that ancient terminology in visceral physical reality so we truly grasp the stakes here. Imagine a society with no police force, no central constitution, no independent judiciary. If someone steals your property or threatens your life, you cannot dial an emergency number and expect a neutral state apparatus to intervene. In that environment, your only life insurance, your only source of justice, and your only economic safety net is your bloodline.
The more brothers, cousins, and uncles you have capable of wielding a sword, the safer you are. Justice is literally determined by how much muscle you can bring to a dispute.
Exactly. In that system, value is entirely derived from brute force and numerical advantage. It is a system completely devoid of an ideological, ethical, or merit-based framework. If you are part of the massive armed USPA, you dictate the law. If you are weak, intellectual, or isolated, you are prey.
So when the 10 older, stronger half-brothers look at Yusuf, they are not just experiencing standard sibling rivalry. They are not just annoyed that their dad likes the younger kid more. They are looking at a fundamental existential threat to their entire worldview.
This is the core of the social physics. The father, Yaqub, represents the system of law, prophethood, and merit. He is the governing body in this microcosm, and he values Yusuf based on intellectual capacity, character, and visionary potential, the traits required to actually sustain a civilization.
But the brothers, the Yusba, are operating entirely under the old social contract of tribalism. They expect to be valued by the governing body simply because they have the muscle. They are thinking, we are the 10 strong men, we protect the flocks, we do the heavy lifting, we are the muscle and the nerve of this family. Why is the governing system prioritizing a 15-year-old intellectual over a brute force?
And when a governing system begins to prioritize intellect, merit, and ethical character over brute force and bloodlines, the old guard, the muscle, experiences an intense perceived inequality. They feel they are being robbed of their rightful status and power.
It is a scientific, almost mathematically predictable reaction. When the muscle realizes it is becoming obsolete in the face of intellect, it does not adapt. It reacts violently to reassert dominance. What we are witnessing isn't just a family dispute. It is the exact mechanism of how a societal system collapses when emotional impulse, specifically jealousy, arrogance, and the desperate urge to maintain the status quo, violently overrides merit and law.
And the most terrifying aspect of this societal collapse is how the corrupt system justifies its own violence to itself. The text exposes the profound cognitive dissonance required to maintain a mob mentality.
Verse 9 is genuinely chilling when you break it down. The brothers sit together and formulate their conspiracy. They say, let's kill Yusuf or cast him out into some unknown, desolate land so that our father's attention will be exclusively ours. They are planning the premeditated murder of a child, their own blood.
Right.
And then in the very same breath, they add the ultimate self-delusion, and after that, we will become righteous people.
It's wild. It perfectly captures the absurdity and the profound danger of the mob. They believe they can execute a horrific, irredeemable act of violence to secure their power, and then simply flip a switch and return to being moral, upstanding citizens the next morning.
We are going to assassinate the visionary, destroy the meritocracy, and upend the system of justice. But don't worry, we've scheduled our own righteousness for next Tuesday.
Right, exactly.
You cannot plan a murder and simultaneously plan your own redemption. It is the ultimate psychological compartmentalization.
But this is exactly how systemic corruption sustains itself throughout history. The mob, the Uzba, always justifies its brutality by promising a return to order and morality immediately afterward. They convince themselves that the violence is just a temporary necessity to fix the system.
Which is terrifying.
It is. If we connect this back to verse 5, we see the text identifying the true nature of this corruption. When the father warns Yusuf not to share his vision with his brothers, he explicitly states, Satan is an open enemy to man. The source material provides a crucial, non-mythological reframing of this concept of Satan.
Because the popular imagination usually pictures Satan as an external entity, right? A monster with horns and a pitchfork whispering in your ear, actively making you do bad things. It's an incredibly convenient externalization of blame. If the devil made me do it, I am not truly responsible for my actions.
But the source clarifies that in the context of this social physics, Satan is not an external monster haunting the desert. Satan is the symbolic representation of these exact internal destructive human impulses. It is the blinding tribalism, the irrational jealousy, the cognitive dissonance, and most specifically, the destructive urge to tear down someone else's merits simply to elevate oneself.
It is the internal rot. By externalizing that rot as a literal monster, the brothers avoid taking any responsibility for their own toxic psychology. They genuinely believe they can murder Yusuf, blame it on a wild animal, and then be good people because they haven't addressed the fact that the monster is actually inside their own minds. They are the wolves.
And that horrific realization leads us directly to the physical execution of their conspiracy. The emotional impulse of the mob has reached its peak, and the intellectual threat must be forcefully removed from the system.
Which brings us to the climax of today's deep dive, the execution of the plot, found in verses 10 to 14. The brothers have reached a consensus. But one brother, perhaps experiencing a slight twinge of conscience, suggests a compromise. He says, don't kill Yusuf outright. Instead, throw him into the bottom of the jub.
The use of the word jub here is another incredible linguistic nuance highlighted by our sources. In Arabic, there are no true synonyms. Every word carries a highly specific, precise shade of meaning.
Right, so let's unpack that.
Well, if you want to say well in Arabic, the most common word is bir. A bir is a functioning well. It is a sign of life and civilization. It typically has a parapet, a protective wall built around the top. It holds water. Travelers stop by it. Merchants trade near it. Shepherds water their flocks from it. It is an ancient hub of activity and survival.
But the text does not say they threw him into a beer. It says they threw him into a jub.
And a jub is something entirely different and deeply terrifying. A jub is a blind, unlined, parapetless pit dug straight into the earth. It is often dry, abandoned, and located out in the desolate wilderness, far from any trade routes. Because it has no wall around it, the wind blows the desert sand over the opening, camouflaging it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it represents total abandonment, darkness, and absolute ruin. There is no infrastructure, no water, and no hope of rescue. If you fall into a jub, you are removed from the world of the living. No one is coming by to hear you scream.
It is the physical embodiment of exile and erasure. So the brothers formulate their plan. They approach their father, Yaqub, and trick him into letting Yusuf go with them out into the wilderness under the guise of playing and having a picnic.
And the father's reaction is a profound display of the psychological dynamics we discussed earlier, the interplay between the conscious and the unconscious mind, and the heavy burden of Kawil.
When they ask to take Yusuf, the father expresses his reluctance using two very distinct emotional terms. He says it gives him huzn that they take him away, and he fears khawf that a wolf will eat him while they are negligent.
The source breaks down the difference between these two words beautifully. Huzn is described as a deep, pervasive, unconscious sorrow or dread. It is that heavy, sinking feeling in your gut that you can't quite articulate or attach to a specific piece of data. Yaqub possesses Tawil. His statesman-like intuition senses the conspiracy. He feels the oppressive weight of the Yusuf's jealousy. His intellect knows exactly what the brothers are capable of, but he is still a father, and his conscious mind grasps for a logical, acceptable excuse to keep his youngest son safe without directly accusing his older sons of premeditated murder.
So his conscious mind articulates the khawf, a specific, rational, identifiable fear of the literal wolves that roam the wilderness.
And the tragic irony of that moment is staggering. The father articulates a fear of the literal wild wolves of the desert. He is looking right at his son, saying, I'm afraid the wolves will get him. But his husband, his deeper intuition, knows the truth.
The true predators, the real wolves, are not hiding in the desert brush. They're standing right in front of him, asking for permission to take their brother. They are completely blinded by tribal arrogance and the emotional impulse to destroy the merit they cannot possess.
They are the wolves of the old system, and they are about to cast the visionary future into the dark.
And this brings us to a crucial reframing of this entire event for you, the listener. As we wrap up this deep dive into the first 14 verses, you have to look at Yusuf's impending descent into the well, into the jub, through the lens of social physics, not just as a tragic narrative beat.
It is not simply a sad story about familial betrayal or bullying. According to the social physics outlined in the text, it is the necessary, inevitable isolation of the intellectual.
Yeah, because when a society is actively decaying, when it is running purely on the chaotic emotional impulses of the mob, and when tribalism and brute force have entirely replaced merit and law, well, the visionary intellect cannot survive within that system. If Yusuf stays in the tent with the Uspa, he will be crushed. He must be isolated from the decay.
Well, the Jubs is not just an attempted murder. In the grand mechanics of societal reconstruction, it is a quarantine.
An incubator.
Yes. The visionary is cast out so they can survive the impending, inevitable collapse of the old tribal system. In that dark, isolated space, stripped of all previous support structures, the visionary incubates the new law, the new intellect, that will eventually be required to save the very society that expelled them.
That is so profound. It completely flips the narrative of victimhood on its head. The historical X-ray we've been looking at isn't just showing us the chaotic shattering of a broken bone, it's showing us the painful, absolutely necessary setting of the bone so it can heal stronger.
Exactly.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to take away today. We all face moments where the systems around us feel like they are collapsing. Maybe it's not a violent tribal society. Maybe it's toxic office politics, a corrupt institution, or a community running purely on irrational emotional impulses and groupthink.
We all experience that.
Right, so when you find yourself cast out, when you are thrown into the dark, isolated, unlined wells of your own life, forced out by the jealousy, the incompetence, or the mob mentality of the people around you, how do you view that exile? Are you merely a victim of unfair circumstances and brutal social physics?
Or are you being intentionally isolated by a higher logic?
Are you, like Yusuf, being put into the dark, not to perish, but to incubate a vision? A vision and an intellect that, once fully formed, will eventually reform the very system that expelled you. Just think about that the next time you feel like you've been cast into the jub.
The absolute darkness might just be the only sterile environment where the seeds of a true revolution can safely begin to grow.
Until next time, keep looking at the thorns to understand the garden.